The blast wave slammed straight into his chest, like someone swinging a sledgehammer from the inside. The office windows shattered into a rain of knives in the air. The air was sucked out, ears ringing, every sound gone for one heartbeat. Then the screams, people calling out to each other in the smoke, ambulance sirens wailing from every direction at once. One corner of downtown Bogotá, cars, brick walls, glass panels, people who had just taken their first morning sip of coffee, rose up in a cloud of gray dust. The files called it the worst terrorist attack of the year. The news said it targeted a security agency. Reporters spoke of an attack on the heart of the Colombian state. But in Pablo Escobar's mind, this was not just an explosion. It was his answer to a single word that for months, the president, judges, generals, journalists, Americans, Colombians, everyone had been whispering: extradition. No one in the blinding dust that morning knew Escobar had been preparing for this moment for months. And what he did in those months didn't just keep him out of a U.S. prison cell. It rewrote the rules of power for an entire nation. The breaking glass and gray smoke in Bogotá were only the result. The real question began much earlier, on a dusty hillside in Medellin. Who was Pablo that he dared blow up an entire city block over a signature in Bogotá? The answer wasn't in the moment. He ordered how many pounds of explosives loaded into the truck. It lay in the years before, when a boy from a peasant teacher family began to understand one thing in Colombia: the law only existed for people who had no money and no guns. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was not born in a villa with iron gates, but in a simple house, red dirt caked on his shoes. His father grew vegetables. His mother taught school. Money was always short. From very early on, Pablo learned to fill that gap, not with good grades, but with small law-bending schemes, selling fake diplomas, stealing gravestones to resell, running contraband trucks over mountain roads. His teenage years had few books, but one lesson repeated over and over in Medellin: the ones willing to take risks to get their hands dirty lived better than the good ones. When cocaine appeared as a new white gold river, Pablo already had two things most men in Medellin lacked: a smuggling network and a mind that always asked, "How do I go further?" He started like many others, a small link in the chain from coca leaves in Peru and Bolivia to living rooms in America. But very quickly, Escobar refused to stay in the middle. He gathered people, routes, even airspace, from makeshift airstrips on Colombian plains. Small planes took off carrying bales, flew over the Caribbean, landed in Florida, then flooded into Miami, New York, Los Angeles. If you lived in America in the 1980s and ever saw cocaine in a club, on a glass table, in a bar bathroom, or in evidence on the TV news, whether you knew his name or not, you had breathed Pablo Escobar's air. At its peak, estimates said, most of the cocaine entering the U.S. passed through the Medellin cartel. Every day, millions of dollars flowed back to Colombia, through banks, through politicians' pockets, through suitcases of cash hidden in Escobar's walls. From dirt hills, he built haciendas with private runways, a zoo with hippos, tigers, giraffes. But what he built most wasn't palaces for himself. It was an image for others. In the poor barrios on Medellin's hillsides, Escobar didn't appear as a boss. He appeared as Don Pablo, the man who paid to build entire rows of houses for families who had lived in tin shacks, the man who pulled out his wallet to cover hospital bills for a feverish child the hospital didn't want to keep, the man who gave young men soccer fields, uniforms, cleats, so they could play ball instead of carrying guns for someone else. There, When people said Pablo, they said it in the tone Harlem once used for Bumpy Johnson, the man who stood between the community and the wolves outside. But from Washington looking down, the picture was completely different. In DEA CIA White House reports, Escobar was not Don Pablo. He was the king of cocaine, the man who made American streets explode with violence, filled American hospitals with overdose patients, and poured American budgets into a drug war with no clear path to victory. Every suitcase of money he sent back to Colombia meant another newspaper story in Miami about a shootout, a pipeline, an Italian restaurant used as a money laundering front. To Washington, the name Pablo Escobar wasn't just the world's richest criminal. It was a hole in America's prestige. How could one man in Medellin influence what kids in New York snorted every weekend? When America began using the word extradition as the answer, they thought they were using a normal legal tool. Sign the treaty, prepare the file, send the request. To America, extradition was simply, you committed crimes on our soil, you'll stand trial on our soil. But to Pablo Escobar, and men like him, extradition wasn't a treaty clause. It was an unofficial death sentence. In Colombia, Escobar had mountains, soldiers, police on his payroll, judges who looked the other way. In America, he would just be a prisoner number. In a system where no one answered his calls, no one traded their life for his, no one owed him any favors. There, cash couldn't buy helicopters, couldn't buy the instincts of street kids on lookout, couldn't buy an entire countryside going silent when he hid. To the Medellin cartel, extradition wasn't fair trial, it was being stripped of everything that made you who you are. That's why, when the group Los Extraditables appeared, they didn't choose soft words. They called themselves the Extraditables. But the message to all of Colombia was clear. Better a grave in Colombia than a cell in America. To outsiders, it sounded like a slogan. To Pablo Escobar, it was a playbook. It was a promise of what would happen on the streets of Medellin, on the avenues of Bogotá. Every time someone in the presidential palace whispered extradition as a clean solution. While the smoke in Bogotá still clung to the shattered windows, a few weeks earlier, another door had closed behind the men who believed they controlled the story. No microphones, no cameras, just dark suits, the smell of black coffee, and the name Pablo Escobar sitting in the middle of the table. We can't let a white powder dealer write our laws for us, the Minister of Justice said at first, not looking at anyone in particular. On the wall, a map of Colombia with red pins clustered thickly around Medellin, Cali, Bogotá, lines drawn to Miami, New York, Houston. At the bottom, the death count updated in red pen, hurried strokes. The American representative leaned forward, tapping his pen lightly on the thick file. Then let us handle it. He said it mixing Spanish and English. He belongs in a federal prison, not on magazine covers, not on barrio walls, not in the myths kids tell each other. A general uniform still dusty from a field inspection, slammed his finger on the table. We've deployed the army, we've spilled blood in every alley. And then what? Yesterday 3 more cops dead in Medellin. Last month, a judge shot right in front of his house. If this keeps up, we won't have officers left to send, no judges left to sit on the bench. The security agency director flipped open a color newspaper, a photo of Escobar with a half smile on the front page of a foreign magazine. Headline about the world's richest drug lord. Every time we shoot at him, he said slowly, we're only shooting at our own shadow. They see this image and think Colombia is cocaine, not the Constitution, not the courts, not the flag. At the other end of the table, Alejandro Ruiz sat silent for a long time. He was the youngest in the room, tie slightly crooked, face speckled with hastily shaved stubble. He had read every file on the table. He had also read the list of judges killed over the past 10 years, every name, every burial place. When the young officer mentioned the 3 new dead cops, Alejandro thought of the small photo on his desk, his 2 kids standing in front of the school gate, smiling at the camera. The Americans want us to extradite him. The president spoke up, voice hoarse from lack of sleep. They say, over there he won't have mountains to hide in, no private army, no judges to buy. They say, if we don't send him over, aid will change, relations will change. He looked around, eyes stopping on Alejandro. But that's their law. What about ours? Alejandro stared at the blank paper in front of him, not because he didn't know what to write, but because he understood that once the ink touched it, there was no taking it back. The Minister of Justice repeated it, this time aimed directly at him. We can't let a white powder dealer write our laws for us. If he forces us to change the law to fit him, then what's left of the nation? The American representative added, voice soft but the blade in every word. Either you believe in the treaty with us, or you explain to the American people why a man who kills their citizens gets to sit in his hacienda, talking to the press like a statesman. Someone recited the numbers again. How many bombings, how many cops, how many judges, how many journalists. A long list of funerals passing before their eyes, no one wanting to add their own name to it, but no one wanted to be the one to stand up and say, we're powerless. The silence thickened in the room. Alejandro broke it with a sentence that wasn't the loudest, but the clearest. If this law can't touch Pablo Escobar, he said, eyes still on the blank paper, then it can't touch anyone. No applause, just a few heavy nods. The president pushed the file toward him. Then make this law touch him. The decision formed in a few short sentences. They would sign the extradition order. They would create special courts, special investigation units, special security forces. They would get Escobar out of Medellin, out of Colombia, push him into a system where his cash was just numbers in a file, no longer the payroll for cops, judges, politicians, on the table. Someone wrote 2 big words in red pen on a notepad. Problem Escobar. Below it, they sketched the rough answer. Extradition. Outside, Bogotá kept moving. Cars honking. People buying coffee before work. No one knew that. In a glass-walled room, a few men were convinced they had just found the silver bullet to solve the Pablo problem. In Harlem years earlier, the Italian bosses had written Bumpy Johnson on the board and called it a problem. They thought one-hit contract, one close associate turning the gun, and it was done. In Bogotá, they wrote Pablo Escobar at the top of the extradition order, and believed one signature was enough. They didn't hear the very faint ticking under the foundations of their own buildings. That very signature, as the ink dried on the page in front of Alejandro Ruiz, had started the countdown clock that Pablo Escobar had long ago set in his mind, and on the streets. The name Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria sat on the very first line, bolded black ink. Under the cold white neon light of the office, those letters glowed as if lit from within. Alejandro Ruiz held the pen, the tip touching the paper, a blot of ink spreading, turning his fingerprint into the final part of a story that so many had bled to push this far. On the desk, next to the thick file and the cold cup of coffee, was a small framed photo, his wife, his 2 children standing in front of the sea, sand on their feet, smiling shyly at the camera. The desk phone buzzed once, twice, then stopped. Someone dialing wrong. Someone reminding him that outside this room, life went on. Ruiz finished the last letter of his signature, lifted the pen. the first extradition order bearing Escobar's name officially existed. It would leave his hands, pass through court levels, diplomatic channels, across desks in Washington. But at this moment, it was just a sheet of paper on the desk, between the neon light and the family photo. The next morning, that sheet was no longer alone. Instead, there was a new stack of files, neatly placed by an assistant whose eyes wouldn't meet his. Ruiz opened the second file, another name from the Medellin cartel, one who ran the flight routes, one who handled finances, one who directed killings. Each name was a line connecting to Escobar, a link in the network all of Colombia was trying to unravel. Each name, in the eyes of Los Extraditables, was a reason for one more body on the street. Ruiz signed again. Escobar's name was no longer alone on paper. It dragged an entire procession of people onto the extradition list, onto DEA maps, onto the whiteboards where the Americans sketched cartel diagrams. That afternoon, when he came home for lunch, his wife handed him a brown envelope. "This morning, someone slipped it under the door," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. No sender's name. Ruiz opened the envelope. Inside there were no words, just a photo taken with a long lens. His two children on the sidewalk, backpacks on, crossing the street, laughing with each other. In the bottom corner of the photo, the name of their school, written in red pen. On the back of the photo, no message, no threat, none needed. That night, the home phone rang near midnight. Ruiz picked up. On the other end, no voice at first, only very light breathing, then prolonged silence. He was about to hang up when a low, hoarse voice, not necessarily Escobar's, but definitely someone who didn't need introduction, slowly read the name of the street where his parents were living, in a small distant town. Then the click of the receiver, no greeting, no demand. The third day after the first order was signed, an old sedan parked 2 houses down from his gate, under the shade of a banyan tree. It arrived at 7 in the evening, while the family was having dinner, and was still there when he pulled the curtain to look out at midnight. The next morning, it was gone. That evening, it reappeared. Same spot, same license plate. For 3 straight nights, the car sat silently in front of his house, like a strange dog no one dared approach. From government buildings, the tough statements kept being repeated like a prayer. "We do not negotiate with criminals." The minister said it to the press, to ambassadors, to Ruiz himself in a private meeting. "You are the face of a Colombia that does not bow." People patted his shoulder, called him valiente, brave. They spoke of principles, of history, of a new wind. When they left the room, they got into cars with drivers, drove down streets where any other vehicle could be an unexploded bomb. Meanwhile, in Medellin, the story of Alejandro Ruiz was told at a different table. No neon lights, just cigarette smoke and the faint sound of bolero music in the distance. "First, buy him," a subordinate suggested, leaning back in his chair, feet up on the table. "Everyone has a price. Wife, kids, parents. We pay his debts, pay for the kids' future. If that doesn't work, then," he made a hand gesture, pretending to pull a trigger, the bang unspoken but understood by all. Escobar listened, silent for a moment. He looked up at the wall, where a different map of Colombia hung, with colored pins unlike those in Bogotá. His pins didn't just mark locations. Each pin was a story, a network, a person who owed him a favor or owed him fear. "Kill him. And then what?" Escobar asked, setting his cigarette down in the ashtray. "Tomorrow, they find someone else to sign. The day after, another one." "How many bullets is enough?" The subordinate shrugged. In his mind, the math was always simple. Troublemaker. Erase. Escobar hadn't survived this long with simple math. He shook his head slightly, voice even, no trace of anger. "I don't need to buy Alejandro Ruiz," he said. "I need the whole country to understand that signing my name means signing their own death warrant. Not just Ruiz's, not just the judges, but anyone foolish enough to believe a signature on paper was a clean act, bloodless." A few days later, Los Extraditables sent their first message, not through a spokesman, through sheets of paper slipped under doors, faxes to newspaper offices, cassette tapes mailed to TV stations. Same content, plain words. "For every paper you sign, someone will lie on the street. You don't choose the victim. You only choose whether to sign or not." It didn't name Ruiz, but everyone working in the building where he sat knew who the letter was addressing. In his office, Ruiz read a copy of the message on his desk. He folded it, placed it under the mousepad, as if he could drown those words. That afternoon, he signed 2 more extradition orders. That evening, he didn't go to bed. He lay on the living room sofa, pistol within reach on the coffee table. Every time a car passed outside, headlights weeping across the ceiling, his heart tightened, waiting for the explosion that didn't come. His wife and 2 children had already left that house. They had been moved to a safe house in another neighborhood, with police guards, high fences, cameras on the walls. But fear didn't stay at the old address. It followed them, lay in his wife's eyes when she called her husband, lay in the way the 2 kids flinched at loud noises. One evening, he visited his wife and children at the new place. The house looked like any other middle-class home. Sofa, TV, pictures on the walls, only different in the 2 policemen outside the gate, with hands resting on their holsters. His daughter ran out to hug him, the familiar smell of cheap shampoo. The older son, about 10, stayed on the couch, eyes glued to the TV news, showing another bombing in Medellin. When the little girl had run to the kitchen with her mother, the boy turned to him and asked very softly, as if asking about homework, "Dad, are you a good guy or a bad guy?" Ruiz froze. At school, the boy continued, not waiting for an answer. "They say people are dying because of what you do, because of the papers you sign. Is that true?" In that safe room, between freshly painted walls, Alejandro Ruiz, the man who had just signed the extradition order for the world's most dangerous drug lord, couldn't find an answer short enough and honest enough at the same time. He didn't say Dad is a good guy. He didn't say Dad is a bad guy. He just stayed silent, reached out to stroke his son's hair, the words he had once said in the meeting room echoing in his head. "If this law can't touch Pablo Escobar, it can't touch anyone." Back then, he hadn't thought the law would touch his own family first. In New York, they joke that news travels faster than taxis. In Colombia, in the late 1980s, news traveled faster than helicopters, and it often flew past Pablo Escobar's mansion before reaching any minister's meeting room. It didn't follow official channels. It flowed through the ears of people no one noticed: taxi drivers, checkpoint cops, cleaning staff, the typist secretary, the phone technician, staring at tangled cables in front of him. Each held a piece. Escobar was the one who put them together. One morning, a taxi driver in Bogotá picked up 2 men in gray suits from the Ministry of Justice and drove them to the presidential palace. They sat in the back, thinking the small glass partition and the radio music were enough to cover their conversation. They talked about this afternoon's meeting on extradition, about reassigning judges to the special courts, about tremendous pressure from the U.S. Embassy. The driver didn't understand all the terms, but he caught the time, the place, a few names. He didn't know how to write reports. He just knew that after dropping them off, he pulled over to a public phone booth on the corner, dialed a number he had memorized without looking. On the other end, a low voice answered, asking briefly, "What time? Who?" The information moved on, bypassing every security layer. At night, a cleaning woman passed an empty courtroom, arms full of bucket and mop. On the table, someone had left a document, a few crumpled pages tossed carelessly into the trash. She didn't read it, but she saw the bold headline before clipping it with the garbage. Judge Assignments, Special Extradition Court. She remembered 2 or 3 names, the start date of the session, the room number. The next morning, a brown envelope with no sender appeared on an intermediary's desk in Medellin. A traffic cop stood at a checkpoint on the road leading to the special unit's base hunting Escobar. He wasn't allowed inside, but he saw every armored vehicle pass. He heard soldiers in the vehicles shouting out half-joking remarks about next week hitting, which comuna, next month getting more U.S. helicopters. He memorized it, not on paper, but in his head. After his shift, he stopped at a small bar where someone was waiting. He recounted it like talking about soccer. The listener didn't take notes, but the next morning, that information lay in a report on Escobar's desk. At the Ministry of Justice, a neatly haired secretary sat at her typewriter, typing line after line of extradition orders, dispatches to Washington. She knew better than anyone the names on Alejandro Ruiz's desk, knew the selected judges, knew even those who had cleverly claimed sudden illness to dodge it. She never wrote those names anywhere else, but sometimes, at the end of the day, she visited an aunt in another neighborhood. There, a middle-aged man often came to play cards, always steering the conversation sharply toward the courts, without ever asking directly. The phone technician's job seemed boring, monitoring the main lines for government agencies, ensuring calls between the presidential palace and the Ministry of Justice, between departments within Bogotá, stayed connected. He wasn't allowed to listen to content, but he saw which numbers called each other, the duration, the frequency. He knew when the line to the U.S. Embassy lit up red unusually. He knew when, in the dead of night, Alejandro Ruiz's internal extension received a call lasting exactly 23 seconds, then hung up. Those things, plus stray sentences overheard while replacing a faulty phone in a room, were enough to form a picture no newspaper ever had. All those pieces, voices falling into the ears of people thought invisible, names accidentally exposed on pages tossed in the wrong place, poured into one spot, Pablo Escobar's desk in his hacienda. On the wall, a map of Colombia. On the desk, phones that never stopped ringing. Before the evening news ran a special report on the National Security Council meeting, Escobar already knew the time, the agenda, who sat where. Before Alejandro Ruiz opened the envelope with the names assigned to the extradition court, Escobar had a similar list, sometimes more detailed. Before Washington finished drafting the press release on the new anti-drug aid package, Escobar had heard the figures and conditions over someone's hot line. He didn't just react, he acted first, and he didn't shoot at the thickest spot. He shot at the thinnest. One morning, a young prosecutor in Medellin got in his car to head to court. He had appeared on TV a few times, speaking firmly that the new generation of Colombian justice wouldn't tremble before the bosses. Red light, his car stopped. A motorcycle with 2 riders pulled up slowly beside him. 2 quick shots. Glass shattered. His head slammed into the steering wheel. The motorcycle sped off. By noon, the news spread everywhere. Anti-cartel prosecutor assassinated. No arrests, no one claimed responsibility. But at the courthouse gate, where he worked. The next morning, a sheet of paper appeared, taped secretly. You sign, others bleed. We just show you the ink. A few weeks later, a judicial building in another city shook. No one saw when the bomb-laden car entered the parking garage. They only remembered the first blast, shattering glass, cracking ceilings, white dust, covering the suits of people just stepping out of courtrooms. It wasn't the biggest explosion in history. It was just a deep scratch on the already thin confidence of the system. That night, Los Extraditables faxed a few newsrooms. The same sentence, the same typeface. You sign, others bleed. In Bogotá, Alejandro Ruiz stood behind the prosecutor's family at the funeral, not wanting them to see his face. He heard the young wife cry herself hoarse, heard the dead man's mother call his name, heard eulogies speak of sacrifice for the law. He knew in the crowd behind him, someone was staring at his back and thinking, if not for your signature, maybe he'd still be alive. He didn't turn around, he just felt something tighten in his chest as the coffin passed. Back at the office, he saw the meeting room seats thinning out, people requesting transfers to civil divisions, people claiming sick leave, people suddenly remembering their right to early retirement. An older judge snapped in a closed meeting. We're not soldiers. We're not paid to leave home, wondering if we'll come back. No one answered. They knew they were living in a war they hadn't signed up for, but the files kept coming, thicker, heavier, and someone had to sign. Medellin had its own meeting room. In front of Escobar was a different stack of papers. A list of names that had become public enemies of the cartel, at least on television. Judges, prosecutors, journalists, senators, candidates, all who had said the word extradition in front of a microphone. His lieutenants, men who didn't read law books but were great at reading faces, pointed to each name, recounting every threat on TV, every interview in the papers. This one called you the cancer of Colombia. That one said extradition is non-negotiable. This guy bragged about signing orders, not afraid of anyone. To them, the solution was obvious. Erase. 1 bullet per name. Escobar listened, twirling a pen out of habit. Then he started crossing out, not marking who had to die. He crossed off those who would be left alone. Here, a diagonal line. There, a red circle. A few names circled, most left untouched. Why not take them all out? One asked. Genuinely surprised, Escobar looked up. Eyes, leaving the list. Kill everyone, and there's no one left to be afraid, he said, voice even, like stating the obvious. Fear needs living witnesses. If everyone who dares talk about extradition dies, the rest will call it fate. I need them to look at the screen, see some still alive after daring to speak, and wonder, what about when it's my turn? The peak of the warnings wasn't a car bomb in a garage. It happened live on television, in a packed public square. Evening, flags waving, loudspeakers crackling. A young presidential candidate stood on the stage, holding the microphone, shirt soaked with sweat. He was the image many wanted to believe in. No cartel ties, no corruption, speaking the language of a middle class tired of war. He breathed into the mic, looked at the crowd, and said the line everyone was waiting for. If I'm elected, no drug lord will hide in Colombia. We will extradite them. We will send them where they belong. In the front rows, people cheered. In bars, people slammed tables. In millions of living rooms, people nodded. On another TV screen, in another place, Pablo Escobar watched the same scene. He didn't turn the sound on. He just watched the man's mouth forming the word, extradition, watched his eyes when he said no drug lord, and understood that if that statement stood unchallenged, it would become law, not just a campaign promise. As the candidate bent down to take a sip of water, a series of small sparks flashed at the edge of the crowd. The first gunshots over TV sounded like dud firecrackers. The screams that followed couldn't be mistaken. The camera shook, the image fractured, a body collapsing, bodyguards rushing to cover, stage lights cutting out. The live broadcaster choked, then switched to another voice. The whole country understood at once what had happened, without waiting for analysis. That night, no one needed Los Extraditables to send another note. The message had been written in bullets, right in the open air. From that day on, anyone standing in front of a microphone, in a closed meeting or an open square, opening their mouth to say extradition, heard the gunshots in their head, even when the street outside only had dogs barking. Alejandro Ruiz watched that rally from a small meeting room in Bogotá, with a few colleagues and an American advisor. When the candidate fell, without anyone saying a word, they all shot up from their chairs, as if springs were under the seats. One cursed. Another buried his head in his hands. Phones in the room rang non-stop. Messages, orders, requests for reports, all pouring in at once. Ruiz felt his stomach knot. Not because he particularly loved the man just shot, but because he saw a straight line connecting the microphone on stage to the extradition files on his desk. That night, when the calls finally quieted, he returned to his office. The window still open to a Bogotá twinkling with car lights, distant helicopter sounds overhead. On his desk, like a cruel joke, the extradition stack was thicker than that morning. The names still there, not vanishing with the gunshots in the square. He sat down, opened the first file. The pen tip touched paper. Somewhere, someone might die because of this line of ink. He knew it, but he also knew that if he didn't write, all the deaths before would mean nothing. When the guns on stage didn't silence them, Pablo Escobar decided it was time to show them what a signature could do to an entire city. In the days before the big explosion, Bogotá had a different kind of weather forecast. Not rain or sun, but whispers about places to stay away from. At the morning coffee shop next to the government building, people lowered their voices. Don't go near those buildings. Lately they've been targeting places with the national flag out front. At the bus stop, a mother held her child's hand, repeating, "Don't go near trucks that have been parked too long." Got it. If you see a big truck sitting still for too long, take another route. In the newspapers, there was no high-risk areas section, but people drew their own maps in their heads. Any street with a ministry, a court, a security headquarters, a major bank, a TV station, all automatically colored red. Some changed their commute to work or school, not because the government ordered it, but because they had seen too many identical scenes: shattered glass, rising smoke, ambulance sirens. In that atmosphere, Alejandro Ruiz still sat in his neon-lit office, facing extradition files. Each stack of paper was a name, a pipeline, a promise to the Americans that Colombia was doing its part. One afternoon, as he stepped out of the building, a group of reporters blocked him. Microphones thrust forward, cameras with lights on. "Mr. Ruiz, are you afraid to keep signing these orders?" The question wasn't sarcastic. It was what the whole country wanted to hear answered. Ruiz looked into the lens for a few seconds. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, tie slightly crooked. "Afraid," he said. "No beating around the bush. I'm human too. I have a family. Of course I'm afraid." The reporters fell silent for a moment, waiting for the rest. Ruiz breathed lightly, as if reminding himself to continue. But fear, he went on, isn't a reason to stop doing what's right. That evening, the quote was clipped and played over and over on the news. Some wrote it down, repeated it at restaurants, saw it as a kind of courage. Others heard it, shook their heads, thought to themselves, right for whom? In another room, far from those TV lights, Pablo Escobar also watched that interview, not on television, but on a recorded tape. He didn't smirk, he just tilted his head slightly, like placing a new piece on the board. That night, in his compound, among silent lieutenants waiting for orders, he spoke slowly, as if thinking out loud. They think I'm afraid of an American prison. One nodded, as if that were obvious. They're wrong, Escobar said. An American prison only kills one man. I want something else. He turned to the map on the wall, his hand tracing a line from the mountain region people still called his territory down to Bogotá. I want every time they say extradition, he said, they look out the window and wonder how much of this city is left. A few days later, an ordinary truck left an ordinary warehouse on the outskirts of Bogotá. License plate intact, no special logos on the sides. The driver wore a short-sleeved shirt, sunburned arms, cheap pop music on the cabin radio. He cursed like any other driver in traffic, pounded the steering wheel, honked uselessly. No one gave him a second look. No one asked what the truck was carrying. The real story wasn't in the technical details of planting the bomb. Those were for investigation files, not for onlookers. The story was that the truck, on a busy morning like any other, casually rolled into the city center and parked in a spot anyone might have walked past right in front of the National Security Agency headquarters. The place where people always claimed they knew every risk in advance. Inside the building, employees passed through checkpoints, swiped badges, greeted each other, lifted coffee cups. One checked the time, complained, "It's only Monday, and it already feels like Friday." On an upper floor, a meeting was about to start, discussing new measures to protect judges, protect officials, protect the city from the very bombs. They still couldn't figure out how they got there. In the parking lot next door, the truck sat still, as if it had been parked there forever. The next moment, at the beginning of this story, we saw it from the outside, shattered glass, gray smoke, ears ringing, chest hammered from within. Now, let's see it from the inside. White flash, glass, air gone, then everything dust. The people who had just entered the meeting room didn't finish hearing the first sentence. The people typing didn't save their files. The coffee cups didn't even fall from hands. In seconds, ceiling, walls, desks, chairs, people all blended into one white cloud. When the smoke began to clear, sounds of people returned. Groans, calling names, metal scraping twisted metal. On the street, pedestrians stopped, turned, saw a column of smoke rising from what had been a concrete block. No one cared anymore what it was called, what three-letter acronym. They just saw their city looking like footage from a war news report in some faraway country. Cars burning, windows blackened, people running in panic, dust instead of sky. Official numbers would come later. How many buildings collapsed or damaged, how many dead, how many injured, how many windows shattered for blocks around. Hospitals overwhelmed, blood mixed with dust on corridor floors. Doctors holding lists of victims mixed with lists of missing staff. But in the first moments, no one counted. They only knew one thing. Bombs were no longer explosions, somewhere far away. This one was in the center, among buildings they had thought invulnerable. At the same time, a new message from Los Extraditables appeared. This time no need for faxes. The content was read on radio, repeated in witness accounts, pasted on walls with white sheets, whispered in restaurants. Every extradition order, =1 explosion. How many more signatures do you have left before there's no city to trade? Here you wasn't just Alejandro Ruiz. It was everyone who had sat in that glass room, nodded, decided that the answer to the name Pablo Escobar lay in the International Judicial Cooperation section of a treaty. Alejandro Ruiz arrived at the scene with others, not as a victim, but as an official. He walked between rows of ambulances, looked at bodies covered with white sheets laid temporarily on the sidewalk, awaiting identification. For a moment, he thought he was looking at strangers, names that would only appear tomorrow in newspapers as numbers. Then he saw a face. The man was a legal staffer. Ruiz used to have coffee with every morning in the building cafeteria, the one who told stories about his toddler learning to walk, who joked, "You deal with the cartel on paper. I deal with them in files." Now he lay still, one side of his shirt charred, hair caked with dust, the sheet pulled over, covering the familiar face. Ruiz turned away, but the image followed him. For the first time, in his eyes, the certainty was no longer intact. A question arose, though he tried to push it down. Are my signatures saving this country, or pushing it deeper into a hole with no visible bottom? In Medellin, news of the blast arrived faster than the investigators. People whispered the death toll, the bomb's weight, the cracked concrete slabs. In Escobar's compound, a lieutenant ran into the room, face a mix of fear and excitement, recounting every detail like commentating a victory. Escobar listened, took a drag on his cigarette, blew out smoke, eyes aimed somewhere out the window. He didn't smile, no clapping, no cheering. He just asked one question, voice calm to the point of chilling. Do they still say extraditions like it's a normal word? The messenger fell silent. He didn't know how to answer. In the days that followed, in Bogotá, every time a politician tried to talk about the treaty, about judicial cooperation, about we cannot back down from criminals, they looked out the window, not to admire the sky, to make sure the building was still standing. In court hallways, extradition was no longer said aloud. It became an abbreviation, a circumlocution, replaced with that process, that measure, as if saying the real name would pull in another bomb. Some in the system tried to keep up appearances, saying on TV that we will not be subdued by terrorism. But beneath those words, the city had understood something no one needed to explain. The situation had shifted. It was no longer the state hunting one criminal. It was one man using the entire city as a hostage in his own chess game. Some people only need a silenced bullet, a click in a crowded room to teach everyone a lesson about loyalty. In Bogotá that day, the lesson was written with a blast heard across the city, and the blackboard was the collapsed walls. One side didn't need to spill blood to prove it was 3 moves ahead. The other drew its path with bodies, and forced the whole nation to memorize the language of fear. After the explosion, the city didn't just have to clean up broken glass and crumbled concrete, they had to clean up the coffins too. Funeral after funeral, one day at this church, the next at another. The speeches so similar people could recite them by heart. He sacrificed himself for a better Colombia. White flower wreaths piled thick at the doors, black ribbons tied across fences, TV cameras panning over tear-streaked faces, lingering on the flag-draped coffin. On the podium, they spoke of resolve not to retreat. On the streets, people told each other something else. Don't say that word out loud. Don't be foolish enough to say extraditions in a crowded place. In the buildings with newly installed bulletproof glass, meetings resumed, no longer with the confident voices of before. This time hands rested on the table more, eyes looked down at papers more. The hardliners spoke harshly. If we drop extradition, we publicly kneel before a drug lord. What will the world see? That a nation changes its constitution to protect the man who kills its own people. They talked about the message sent to Washington, to neighboring countries, to other traffickers, watching Colombia as a test case. The pragmatists didn't snap back, but their words weighed heavier. If we don't drop it, we keep burying people every week. Not just cops, judges, but their kids, passers-by, people with no connection, except standing in the wrong spot when a bomb goes off. They held up numbers, not just victims, but businesses closing, tourists canceling trips, investors pulling money, families leaving the city, if they could. Between those two lines, Alejandro Ruiz sat silent, listening to it all. Some called him a hero, the man who dared sign when others' hands shook, who dared say fear isn't a reason to stop doing what's right. Others, behind closed doors, called him a madman, the fool dragging the whole state into a war you can't win with paperwork. He knew both kinds of whispers. He also knew he had gone too far to turn back. In a closed-door meeting, when the debate started circling, Ruiz spoke up, voice not loud but drawing every eye. The law shouldn't be written in the ink of fear, he said. We all agree on that. But if every time we write, the whole city shakes, what ink are we using? The question hung from the ceiling, unanswered, because if they admitted their ink now is blood and dust, no one would have the courage left to pick up the pen. The pressure didn't just come from the death toll or collapsed buildings. It came from finance ministry spreadsheets, credit rating agency reports, unusually long calls from the U.S. Embassy, international organizations. It came from scattered protests, demanding peace at any cost, from editorials asking outright, how many more bodies per extradition order? Squeezed between principle on one side and reality on the other, a new option started being voiced, first as hallway whispers, then as scribbles on scratch paper. Amend the Constitution. More specifically, ban the extradition of Colombian citizens. The idea sounded like betraying everything they had just proclaimed, but it also looked like the only visible escape. If Colombians couldn't be extradited, Pablo Escobar, even if caught, tried, jailed, would stay on their soil. That soothed some national pride. We handle our own problems on our own land. It also opened a door to quiet negotiation with men like Escobar. You surrender, we promise not to send you to America. You do time here, and in exchange you give this city a chance to breathe without hearing explosions every morning. The first drafts of the new Constitution, congressional sessions, endless televised debates, people watched intently and skeptically. In one interview, a politician said, "Peace always has its price." He didn't say out loud what the price was, or who paid it. In the dark hallways of Medellin, the news spread faster than any official broadcast. One of Escobar's lieutenants stepped into the room, unable to hide his relief. They're talking about a new constitution. They want to ban extraditing Colombians. They say if the boss plays by the new rules, they might end this. Escobar leaned back in his chair, eyes on the floor for a long moment, as if listening to music, not law. What do they call it? He asked. The New Republic, the lieutenant replied, repeating the phrase the TV loved. Escobar smiled faintly. Not a happy smile, but something like acknowledging a move on the chessboard. That's the answer I demanded. The day they first said the word extradition, he said. It only took them a few years, a few hundred lives, and a few buildings to learn my language. One morning, on radio and TV, anchors solemnly read the main clauses of the new Constitution. Among articles on citizen rights, state structure, there was the sentence everyone waited for: no Colombian citizen shall be extradited to another country. In the square outside Congress, people clapped, released balloons, chanted about the new republic, about a new era of democracy. Politicians shook hands, spoke of the nation's victory over violence, trying to believe they had regained the initiative. In the hillside homes of Medellin, people heard that clause over small speakers, looking out at walls still scarred by bullets. Some truly believed this was the first step to ending violence. Others just sighed. If this had come sooner, how many wouldn't have died? In his hacienda, Escobar replayed the reading of the article several times, like a song written just for him. He didn't need lawyers to explain. He understood better than anyone the meaning of one sentence: no Colombian citizen shall be extradited. To many, it was democracy's triumph, proof that a constitution could be rewritten to reflect the people's will, to close a horrific chapter of history. To Pablo Escobar, it was cold proof that truck bombs could do what ballots couldn't. As soon as the new constitution's ink dried, the deal followed. Pablo Escobar wasn't dragged from his house in the night, handcuffed, thrown on a plane to America as Washington once dreamed. He appeared in the papers with a different image, raising his hands in surrender to the Colombian state, walking into a prison called La Catedral, but a prison whose location he chose, whose walls he designed, whose guards he picked. There were soccer fields, entertainment rooms, private kitchens, views down over Medellin like a king retiring to his castle, not a prisoner. On paper, Escobar was in the hands of justice. In reality, phones in La Catedral still rang, orders still went out, money still flowed, people still died at his signal. Only when murders happened right inside that prison, when stories of parties, women, contracts signed on grounds meant for rehabilitation leaked out, did the state wake up to realizing they had let the wolf choose its own cage. Once again, emergency meetings, minutes, phrases like "time to get tough." They decided to transfer Escobar to a real military prison, walls not drawn by him, guards not on his payroll. The decision came too late, and when the special unit arrived at La Catedral to move him, the cell was empty. That very night, Escobar vanished into the network of tunnels, safe houses, barrios he had once fed. A new hunt began, lasting over a year, with elite search blocks, deeper U.S. involvement, raids, wiretaps, rooftop shootouts. His final day didn't happen in a Miami courtroom as many prosecutors once hoped. It happened on a rooftop in Medellin, among rusty TV antennas and tangled power lines. Escobar, heavier, slower than in his youth, tried running across rooftops to escape the cordon. Finally, he fell face down on red tiles, blood flowing, part of his hip exposed under his shirt. The photo of his body on the roof became the official symbol of victory. The state declared, "Public enemy number 1 dead," a chapter closed. He died in Colombia, on his own soil, not American soil, not in a federal jumpsuit. To those who lost loved ones to bombs, guns, cocaine, it was an ending never equal to what had happened. But this story was never just about the body on the roof. It was always about the shadow. Survivors of the explosions don't remember every clause in the extradition treaty. They remember shattering glass, ringing ears, the smell of smoke and concrete dust, their hearts pounding wildly, the names of people who left for work that morning, and didn't come home that evening. Children grew up with stories of where I was, the day the bomb went off, not what article Congress amended that day. To them, extradition isn't a legal concept. It's a keyword tied to images of smoke rising from downtown. Every drug case since, in Colombia, has unfolded under that shadow. When debating whether to sign new treaties, expand extradition, arrest more, hand more over to the U.S., the question isn't just what does the law say, but if we do, what happens out on the streets. Not always is there someone willing to reuse Escobar's truck bomb language, but as long as that possibility lives in collective memory, every decision has to detour around it. Every major sentence, every sweep operation, carries the silent question: is someone somewhere considering picking up the language Pablo Escobar once spoke so fluently? Elsewhere, far from Colombia, black men in Harlem once made the entire Italian Mafia rethink the game with a silenced pistol, a cold click, and a line that became legend. They proved some things, like loyalty, can't be bought with money or forced with violence. In Medellin and Bogotá, Pablo Escobar used a different tool: hundreds of kilos of explosives, a series of truck bombs, blasts on streets, in courts, in city centers, to prove the opposite. Sometimes, one man, ruthless enough and willing to pay the price, can force an entire nation to reweigh its words in fear. They tried to extradite Pablo Escobar to the U.S. They used what any civilized state believes in: law, treaties, closed-door meetings, signatures under neon lights. They wrote his name at the top of extradition orders, believing from then on it was just procedure. His reply blew up an entire city. He didn't debate in Congress, didn't send op-eds. He answered in the only language any politician understands, no matter the party: fear. Every bomb was a footnote under the word extradition. This is what it really means: for you, not for me. Now Escobar's bombs have been silent for decades. La Cathedral is just a dark tourism spot in guidebooks. The rooftop where he fell has new owners, new tiles. Trucks still roll through Bogotá streets, carrying goods, not explosives. But in Colombia, every time someone writes extradition on paper, their hand, whether they admit it or not, still remembers the feel of a morning when glass shattered, smoke rose from downtown, and the whole country held its breath for a few seconds. Law is ink, fear is the blade. And Pablo Escobar showed an entire nation, in the cruelest way possible, which one cuts deeper.